Hello, Dr. Drake here from SUNY ESF, and today we have another ecologically oriented video during the COVID quarantine period. And the purpose of today's video is to expose students to a couple different forests of different structural attributes, and to investigate some of the historical legacies of prior land use decisions that have happened in those forests. So the forests that are important to you, that you walk through, might be a part of your weekly walk in the woods, are contain within them a legacy of the decisions and actions that people have made in those forests in the past. And I'd like to explore those issues with you today. Okay, let's get started. So let's think about these legacies of land use decisions in a context of the northeastern forests of what is now the United States. And let's of course recognize that these forests were used and managed for many hundreds or thousands of years by native peoples before European settlers arrived. And we can learn a lot from those people. Putting that to the side for the moment, when we think about a pre-settlement, at least a pre-European settlement forests in these areas, they were structurally diverse. Forests that differed in the size, age, and species of these trees, as depicted here with a photo of the Harvard Forest dioramas. These lands were cleared by settlers of European origin primarily during the 18th century, to create small family farms. The soils here were rocky and shallow, and in order to be able to till the soil and plant crops in the way that they knew how to do that, the farmers did the quite backbreaking work of removing all of the rocks from their fields. And they did this so they could plow them, of course. They needed a place to put the rocks, and so they piled the rocks up in rock walls around the side of their fields. This removal of forests and widespread transformation of the Northeast into agricultural use peaked in the middle of the 1800s. So the landscape that you would see around New York and New England with these rolling hills that we now think of as being primarily forested were primarily cleared for agriculture. Although importantly, some areas were not cleared, and remnant woodlots were used primarily as a source of firewood and lumber for buildings. And farming declined at a very broad scale across the northeastern U.S. because of the larger connections that were being made in the economy of the United States, and the establishment of railroads and the connection of peoples to the more fertile agricultural production systems in the Midwest. And so we have an abandonment of tilled farmland across the Northeast and the natural reestablishment of forests onto those abandoned lands. And so what do those forests look like now? Can we notice or can we notice any legacies of these previous land use decisions on forests that exist in the Northeast today?
So here we are at a forest stand at Heiberg Forest, at land owned by SUNY ESF. And this land used to be farmed for agriculture. So we're standing on what was a family farm. This forest was not here, and we had a cleared farmland that was tilled several times over several decades and was actively farmed. That farmland was abandoned, and we had the germination and establishment of a cohort of trees all at the same time. That eventually gave way to this even-aged stand of primarily hardwood trees. And so the stand that you're seeing behind me, its primary components are sugar maple and red maple, with some ash and some very minor components of other trees like black cherry. And all of these trees recruited in the same year. And despite their difference in size, they are all the same age. And that's one of the characteristics of an even-aged forest stand. This even-aged hardwood stand has relatively small amounts of coarse woody debris on the forest floor. You can see some downed tree stems, and some of those, there is some considerably large downed wood, but the understory is relatively simple and open with relatively modest amounts of coarse woody debris providing habitat on the forest floor. One of the things that I want you to appreciate about a even-age stand that was previously tilled is that the tilling evened the surface of the ground. It's challenging to see now given that the ground is covered in snow, but we don't have very much microtopography here. Any of the small bumps and hollows, the hummocks and hollows, were removed by the tilling, and which homogenized the surface of this forest. So if we look up at the canopy of this even-aged hardwood stand, we can see trees are generally of similar dimensions. The canopy trees, their crowns are all relatively narrow and the same size, and we don't have a large amount of vertical diversity in where these trees hold their leaves. So importantly, this is an even-aged forest stand. So I'm touching two trees right now that are very different sizes, and you might naturally think that the larger tree is of course older. And that's not the case in even-aged forests that are recovering or establishing on abandoned agricultural fields. So both of these trees recruited in the same year, and they grew at different sizes, and they grew at different rates, resulting in them being different sizes. So here we have two stem sections that were taken from sugar maple trees. These were collected by a master's student named Colin Bartholomew, who finished his degree with Dr. Chris Nowak at SUNY ESF. And what I'm trying to illustrate with these is that these two stem sections are from trees that are both the same age. These are 75-year-old trees. You can see the ring structures. We know how old these are because Colin Bartholomew very carefully sanded and counted the rings on both of these sections. And this smaller tree has a much tighter set of rings. It grew slower, but it's the same age. And so the individual growth conditions, the site of establishment, the competition for resources can really strongly influence the growth rate of these trees. That allows a tree to get big in 75 years or to stay quite a small size. So do not conflate size and age within trees, particularly in even-aged stands. So this is a even-aged Norway spruce plantation, and so this land was completely harvested and used extensively for agriculture. So the land was plowed many times, and this land was used for farming. There was failed natural establishment on this land, and so this land was planted with Norway spruce trees. And this was done it was quite common and widespread, particularly in the 1920s and 30s, in particular when the Civilian Conservation Corps planted a very large number of plantations like these Norway spruce systems on abandoned agricultural fields that have been left, and that had an important ecological impact of reducing erosion in those systems. So the Civilian Conservation Corps minimized erosion quite successfully, but we're left with these systems of non-native, conifer-dominated systems with very little recruitment into the understory. So if you look around me, you'll see the relative lack of regeneration of new cohorts in this understory. We essentially don't have a functional understory in the system. Not very much habitat value for a wide array of animals because there's low diversity in the structural complexity of this forest, and the trees are of very similar sizes, and there's not a lot of understory. There's a little bit of coarse woody debris in the forest floor of the system, but there's relatively little habitat value in these simple monocultures. So if you look at the canopy of this Norway spruce plantation, we can see that it is quite dense, that individual trees are forced to have narrow crowns because of the density of this stand, but that we have a relatively simple canopy structure of the trees that are of similar size and height. So we have, as in many aspects of this forest, quite a simple forest of low diversity, both in species diversity and in structural diversity. So now we're in a more diverse forest that was not previously used for agriculture, and so it wasn't cleared or plowed. And so we have what is transitioning to an uneven age system, where we have a larger diversity in the sizes of the trees that comprise this forest, from some relatively large and older trees to new cohorts that have established underneath these large trees, which makes this moving towards an uneven aged system. One thing I want you to appreciate is the fact that this stand was not previously plowed means that the soil horizons are intact and have not been homogenized and mixed. And there is more of a rolling topography of this forest. It's hard to see because it's all covered in snow, but there are these small little mounds, these hummocks and hollows, that is characteristic of forests that have not been plowed. If we dig beneath the snow in this remnant woodlot, we find evidence that this land was not previously plowed. And so there are lots of rocks in the surface soils of this system, which are generally not found in systems that have a history of agricultural clearing and plowing, because farmers would have removed these rocks from their fields to facilitate the plowing and agriculture. And so these rocks are evidence of a lack of prior plowing, and they further contribute to the variation in this environment and the kind of habitat value for a variety of organisms. And one thing I'd like to emphasize is that just because this forest wasn't cleared and used for agriculture doesn't mean it doesn't have a prior legacy of land management. So this was a family's woodlot that was used for harvesting firewood, that they used to heat their home and for a variety of uses like boiling maple syrup and maple sugar. And so trees would have, largely the downed trees would have been harvested, and there would have been salvage logging for firewood, but also the removal of individual trees here and there for firewood production. So just because a forest wasn't cleared in the past doesn't mean it wasn't managed in the past. So if we have a look at the canopy of this remnant woodlot of a mixed age forest, we can see a greater diversity in the size and dimensions of the canopy trees. We have some very large trees, like this group of ash in front of me, that have large dominant crowns, and we have other trees that have smaller and more narrow crowns, like this tree here, which has a more narrow crown that occupies a smaller height and is a suppressed tree.
So that's all for today. I hope you learned something from this video. I particularly want to emphasize that legacies of prior land management influence the nature of our ecological systems that we have currently, and that those prior land management decisions influence the structure and the function of ecological systems that alter the habitat value for a wide variety of organisms, and influence the degree to which these forests, in this case, provide the ecosystem services that we value. Thanks very much. Have a good day.